do your dharma. What has become clear is that my yoga is devotion and service. And it's yoga and devotion and service whether I like it or not. Which is Arjuna's predicament. He didn't like it. And finally, you hear what your root is and you start to surrender into your dharma. Okay, that's what Arjuna is being advised to do. And Krishna is saying to him, don't get so upset about it though, because really you're not doing it anyway. Right? He says all actions take place in time, but the man lost in selfish delusion thinks that he himself is the actor. But the man who knows the relation between the forces of nature and actions sees how some forces of nature work upon other forces of nature, and he becomes not their slave. Even a wise man will act under the impulse of his nature. All beings follow nature. Of what use is restraint? That is your body and your personality, your mind, all that lower stuff, that's all part of nature. It's all just lawful stuff. What are you getting so uptight about? Just let it be harmonious with its lawful manifestation. Don't struggle against it so hard. Thus is the wheel of law set in motion, and that man lives indeed in vain who in a sinful life of pleasure helps not its revolution. Now that's another idea we're going to be coming to, but the general drift is, when you're doing your dharma, you are part of Christ's body. You are part of the flow. But the man who has found the joy of the Spirit, and in the Spirit has satisfaction, that man is beyond the law of action. He is beyond what is done and beyond what is not done, and in all his works he is beyond the help of mortal beings. We are now starting to approach another concept. Plotinus says, murders, death in all its shapes, the capture and sacking of towns, all must be considered as so much stage show. So many shiftings of scenes, the horror and outcry of a play. For here too, in all the changing doom of life, it is not the true man, the inner soul that grieves or laments, but merely the phantasm of the man, the outer man, playing his part on the boards of the world. Now, with all that preparation, we're now ready for what would appear to be the major theme, but is really a sort of a minor major theme of the Gita, which is the theme of karma yoga. Let me read you some shlokas to bring it to mind for you. But great is the man who, free from attachments, and with a mind ruling its powers in harmony, works on the path of karma yoga. In liberty from the bonds of attachment, do thou therefore the work to be done, for the man whose work is pure attains indeed the supreme. We're hearing, do your work, but do it without attachment. We're hearing a definition of karma yoga. We're not yet hearing how to not be attached, but we're hearing how to do karma yoga. Set thy heart upon thy work, but never on its reward. Work not for reward, but never cease to do thy work. That means don't be so future-oriented. Don't do this for that, even though you may plan to do this in relation to that. In regard to that, Mahatma Gandhi said it very clearly, I think. He said, in regard to every action, one must know the result that is expected to follow, the means thereto, how to get there, and the capacity for it. He who, being thus equipped, is without desire for the result, and is yet wholly engrossed in the due fulfillment of the task before him, such a man is said to have renounced the fruits of his action. Now, for many of us, this seems very contradictory. People say to you, if you're living in the present moment, how can you think about the results of your acts? Well, how it all works, where it's going to lead to, how it all comes out at this moment. And then out of all that comes a decision to do something, and then you do it. But when you're doing it, you're not doing it with half of your mind waiting to see how it comes out or trying to get the payoff. You're doing it. Then what happens will happen. But when you're doing it, you're doing it. But it's very subtle, because even when you're doing it, there is an awareness of the entire field when you're quiet enough. And who else has said something useful about this is Don Juan in the Castaneda books, in talking about the warrior, because the warrior is the perfect karma yogi. If you want to review the Don Juan books, you'll see all the things he says about the warrior refer to the karma yogi. A warrior is a hunter. He calculates everything. That's control. But once his calculations are over, he acts. He lets go. And he survives in the best of all possible fashions. The mood of a warrior calls for control over himself, and at the same time it calls for abandoning himself. Do thy work in the peace of yoga, and free from selfish desires. Be not moved in success or in failure. Yoga is evenness of mind, a peace that is ever the same. You set up a game, and then you play it purely and lovingly and compassionately and with involvement as pure karma yoga. And then how it comes out is how it comes out. And that's the next conditions for the next dance, at the next mind moment. For work done for reward is much lower than work done in the yoga of wisdom. Seek salvation in the wisdom of reason. How poor those who work for a reward. In this wisdom, a man goes beyond what is well done and what is not well done. Go there, thou therefore, to wisdom. Yoga is wisdom in work. He whose undertakings are free from anxious desire. Free from anxious desire and fanciful thought, whose work is made pure in the fire of wisdom, he is called wise by those who see. I am not doing any work, thinks the man who is in harmony, who sees the truth. For in seeing or hearing, smelling or touching, in eating or walking, or sleeping or breathing, in talking or grasping or relaxing, and even in opening or closing his eyes, he remembers, it is the servants of my soul that are working. It's just nature running off. It's just stuff happening. The yogi works for the purification of his soul. He throws off selfish attachment. It is only his body or his senses or his mind or his reason that works. It's not you. Right? It's not you. It's just your body. It's just your senses. It's just your mind. It's just your reason. It's not you. You hear the wisdom that's being suggested here? What they keep saying, wisdom. What is that wisdom? The wisdom is you aren't who you think you are. Who you think you are is acting, is doing, is collecting, is worried about the reward, and you aren't that one at all. The man of harmony surrenders the reward of his work and attains final peace. The man of disharmony, urged by desire, is attached to his reward and remains in bondage. The ruler of his soul surrenders in mind all work and rests in the joy of quietness in the castle of 9 gates, the body. Gurdjieff said, if you can serve a cup of tea right, you can do anything. In the Tao, the book of Tao, it says, by letting it go, it all gets done. The world is won by those who let it go. But when you try and try, the world is then beyond the winning. Because when you're trying to make a cup of tea right, you're not making a cup of tea right. The way you make a cup of tea right is you get everything you need to make the tea, including knowing how to make the tea, and then you make the tea. And when you're making the tea, you're making the tea. You're not worried about how it'll come out, or wondering whether you're good enough to make the tea, or you're not thinking about the philosophy of tea drinking. Whatever feels like your dharma, do it. But don't get lost in thinking you are the doer. Realize that it is Mother Nature just doing her trip. It's the dance of Maya. It's just the laws unfolding. It's only your incredible egocentricity that makes you think you're doing it. The models that Krishna puts forth for Arjuna, the models of karma yoga. Krishna says, I have no work to do in all the worlds, Arjuna, for these are mine. I have nothing to obtain because I have it all, and yet I work. Krishna says, when the sage climbs the heights of yoga, he follows the path of work. But when he reaches the heights of yoga, he is in the land of peace. That is, when you start out to do works as an upaya, a method, you are still working from within the world of attachment and desire. And no matter how sattvic or pure your work becomes, how controlled, how stabilized, it's still being done within a desire system. There is still a doer doing it. But through beginning to understand the wisdom underlying the whole system of who you are and what it is that's happening, there is an increasing impersonality in your own life. Impersonality. Not less involvement, but less romanticizing, less melodrama, less doer. I am without form, without limit, beyond time, beyond space. Now, if you think of all of these, the buddhi, the ahamkara, the ego, the intellect, the higher intellect, even the atman, instead of thinking them as solid things, just think of them as foci of energy that are just always, just happen to have an intensity that makes them seem solid for the moment. Just think of them as foci. You'll be more comfortable with that. If you begin to hear this game a little bit now you're beginning to explore what's called this wisdom. And you're beginning to understand what the goal of the game is. But you need one more ingredient to understand what this game is. And that concerns the relation between the Atman and what's called the Brahman. Because you are a monad, a single spark of light. And that light is part of light. A part of light. And when you have gone back inside yourself through meditation, through study, through non-attachment, when you begin to understand what non-attachment means, when you're not sucked out by sense desires so that your mind isn't going outward but is free to go inward, where you go in and out are just little metaphors we're playing with. You go inward, you come back into the light, back into it, the one drop, and the one drop is part of the all drop, and you merge into what's called the Brahman, or the all, which we are going to start to relate to the nirvanic state in a little while. When you have attachments, when the thought forms, the habits of thought are very strongly learned, when you're very attached to them, when they are strongly invested, even though you may override them by very intense sadhana practices, such as Kundalini Yoga or Zen or meditative techniques or psychedelics, you will most often, re-enter back into those thought forms. in a slightly different way, but you'll still re-enter. And were you ready to be all done right away, as was Ramana Maharshi, who at 17 years old had done no sadhana whatsoever, nothing. He hadn't studied particularly. He was just a high school student, and he was just lying on his uncle's study floor, and he suddenly felt that he was going to die. And instead of struggling against death, he surrendered into it, and he experienced that his body was dying, and he saw his body being carried to the burning god and burned. And even though his body had died and he saw his personality fall away, he experienced intense presence. Now, that is what is similar to what in Zen would be called a Satori experience, or various other labels for it in Hinduism and Buddhism. The only difference between Ramana Maharshi and the rest of us is that he didn't come back. Well, that isn't exactly true. He stayed around for about 40 more years, but who stayed around was different than who was before that happened. That is, he didn't come back into his traditional thought forms. And so, in that sense, it was a non-returnable But for me, at any rate, I won't say anything about you. That Zen experience turned out to be what would be called a minus satori. And there are some exquisite descriptions of those minus satoris in the back of Kaplow's book, 3 Pillars of Zen. We've been talking about jnana yoga, or the yoga of the intellect, or using the levels of the mind to go beyond thought. And while this is not a course in terminology, and I don't think we need to get too deeply into it, reviewing, we talked about the different parts of the nature package that we are under the illusion that we are, and that includes the senses, the indriyas, the lower mind, which is the lower thinking mind that is picking up information from the senses. That's called the manas, and the ahankara, which is the loci of all these thought patterns that come together and form what we would call our ego structure, which is our plan of the universe, our model of the world around us. And then beyond that is a thing called the buddhi, which is often referred to in relation to what's called the third eye. And that is the doorway. That's on a pivot. And that is the focusing point which can be pulled down into the ego and the senses, and thus you are totally worldly. But at some point that buddhi, which is an apperceptive operation, can turn inward or upward or outward, since all space metaphors are metaphors. It can turn towards another, quote, place, and I'm using the word place in quotations, another place in oneself, which is the source or the light, which is called the Atman. And I talked last time about a slide projector and the light source being inside, going through a series of slides or veils, which determine what appears to be the screen out there, and that you don't even know whether there is a screen or what's out there if the veils are too heavy. And the game of all of sadhana is getting rid of those filters, if you will. And the buddhi as a construct, it's a hypothetical construct the way we're using it, as a construct, it's the only part of our nature package that is capable of grasping the higher realms within us, the Atman. And it's called in the Western literature the soul. And in the mystic Christian literature, the statement, when thine eye be single, thy being will be full of light. That is that one we're talking about, the buddhi, when thine eye be single. The game of yoga, union, is then extricating oneself from the illusion of separateness, extricating yourself from identifying with your ahankara, with your manas, with your lower mind, with all the thoughts that are rushing through, with your sense data, with the sense objects. So instead of me and mine and my thoughts and my feelings and my senses, all this stuff is just stuff. And you are slowly getting free of attachment to this. Remember, karma yoga is non-attached activity. You're getting free of attachment and going back inward towards this Atman, where you will rest in the Atman, rest in the light, the undifferentiated, unconditioned light. And we talked last time about using the intellect as a vehicle to get there, using the mind, and what methods were available for using the mind, which I said was the most powerful siddhi or power tool that we as biped human beings have at our disposal to get to the Atman. The one unique quality that we have, and we ought to use it. And I did say, however, that it is very trapping, it's very seductive, as all powers are. Every yogic power is a tremendous seduction. Because right until the end, when you are merged back into the Atman, you still think you're somebody. And if you think you're somebody that has an incredible power, you tend to get seduced into wanting to use that power. Even in the nice way, like, with this power I can do good. Right? And you get into, I'm going to do something about it. Right? Like with my guru in 1967, November, until this point, thought about him, studied him, reflected him, analyzed him. I can't find anybody there. I keep projecting into him there'll be another person because there's a flesh and blood body there. And as it walks and it talks and it smiles and it laughs and it does all this stuff. But when I look into those eyes, or I reside in that heart, or I quiet down and meditate on the form, or I go towards that guru, it's like I am going into vast emptiness.
Sacrifice.
The world is in the bonds of action unless the action is consecrated, that means offered. Let thy actions then be pure, free from the bonds of desire. That's the beginning lead way Krishna introduces sacrifice. Thus spoke the Lord of creation when he made both man and sacrifice. By sacrifice thou shalt multiply and obtain all thy desires. By sacrifice. By sacrifice shalt thou honor the gods, and the gods will then love thee. And thus in harmony with them shalt thou attain the supreme good. For pleased with thy sacrifice, the gods will grant to thee the joy of all thy desires. Only a thief would enjoy the gift and not offer them in sacrifice. Holy men who take as food the remains of sacrifice become free from all thy sins, but the unholy who eat food that is in truth sin. Food is the life of all beings, and all food comes from the rain above. Sacrifice brings the rain, and sacrifice is sacred action. Sacred action is described in the Vedas, and these come from the eternal, and therefore is the eternal ever present in a sacrifice. Man's act of sacrifice, a man or a woman's act of sacrifice back into the one, completes the wheel. It spiritizes the life. It brings the whole thing into harmony. It makes meaningful an otherwise desperately meaningless existence. It makes us realize that we are part of a process. We are part of the Dharma. We are part of a divine play. And we get by our pomposity of thinking of our personal special gratification, and we see ourselves as part of Christ's body, as I talked about from Paul's letter to the Romans. And you begin to experience the entire universe as linked in one stupendous sacrifice, each offering to the other part. And those of you that have been in human relationships, where love has really been an element of the relationship, you have recognized the experience where the well-being of your beloved is more important than your own well-being. And you offer your own discomfort into the well-being of your beloved. There is a mantra I used to work with, an English mantra, where you focused on your ajna, your sixth chakra, and you would say, I am a point of sacrificial fire held within the fiery will of God. I am a point of sacrificial fire held within the fiery will of God. And if you did that long enough, you became like a burning fire of sacrifice. It's a power mantra. It's a mantra that makes you part of the sacrificial fire. And everything you're doing, you're converting. You're just converting. All your desires, all your perceptions, everything is a conversion. First, you sacrifice thinking of yourself as the doer. How did you do that? By realizing that it was all determined, it's all karmic runoff, it's all lawful. So the minute you understood that, the sacrifice is complete. The minute you remember that, you don't get busy thinking you're doing anything. What's left is the enjoyer, the knower, the witness, the delighter, the collector, the experiencer. And that's the next one you sacrifice. And you sacrifice that into the realization that the big W witness, the big E enjoyer, comes through that merging. That's the Atman in you. That's the real bliss. That's the real place of enjoyment. If you remember God, He takes care of everything. Everything. Why was Christ so maligned, Maharaji? Oh, it's so with all saints. But they only see love in everyone. Maharaji, how did Christ meditate? He lost himself in love. He was one with all beings and had great love for all in the world. He was crucified so that his spirit could spread throughout the world. He was one with God. He sacrificed his body for the Dharma. He never died. He never died. He is Atman, living in the hearts of all. I just love suffering, Maharaji said. It brings me so close to God. You get gyan from suffering, wisdom. Worldly people go outward, but you must go inward like the tortoise, withdrawing within your shell. Serve the poor, Maharaji said. Who's poor, Maharaji? Everyone is poor before Christ. Dada once said to us, the only thing you can offer Him is the purity of your singing to God.